for this second conversation, we'll kickstart with a presentation by the soft-spoken but brilliant George Sapong of the NMC. He's going to set the tone, and then we'll proceed with the conversation. Let's put our hands together for him.
Thank you very much, Francisca, for the very kind words. And I would want to acknowledge His Excellency the President. And one day I'll tell the story of how I got to work for the NMC and his role in it. And I'm very grateful to you. It was a good decision. I'm really grateful, Excellency. In this session, and very quickly, I want you to imagine just a small image of a thread on a spool that you are trying to, as it were, pull off. There are so many simple ways to get this thing done. But if you don't do it well, you hold the wrong end, it gets to a point where it gets into a difficult knot, and you don't know where to go. And that is precisely the nature of technology and broadcasting policy. If you follow the simple processes, you get it simply right. If you don't follow that, you entangle it and it gets complicated. In Ghana, it seems to me that we pulled too many ends and we've created a knot. But the way out is not difficult. So I really want to invite you to just follow me as I make an attempt to systematically identify what the issues are and where we should go. So Okay. So just let's quickly set the stage. When we talk about media regulation, there are two key distinctions that we make: regulation of print and regulation of broadcasting. We regulate them completely differently because a print newspaper, as many people that have money that can afford to print newspapers, can have newspapers. Forget about readers. In fact, there's a story of a newspaper in Japan called Kyoto Shimbun that was printing as many copies as there were people in the city. So if they had a population of 500,000, they were printing 500,000 copies. Okay. In Ghana here, I've joked about fly-by-night newspapers. We've had newspapers that used to print only 10 copies. They print them and distribute them to favorite radio stations. That's the end of it. They get mentioned in the morning show. That's the way it goes. So it's not difficult to print newspapers. Broadcasting, on the other hand, because of what Engineer Fianku explained, because of spectral resources, the use of spectrum and the limitations, you can't have as many as you want. Number two is that broadcasting tends to be intrusive. If I don't want to read a newspaper, I don't want to read. But it's difficult to block off television or radio, because even if you don't want to switch yours on, somebody's radio may get into you. The next reason is that writing, we say perception is simultaneous, but expression is linear. As I look at this table, I see His Excellency and other dignitaries here. But if I have to mention their names, I will have to call them one by one. It is not as if I see them one after the other. I see all of them together. But the nature of expression is such that I can only call them one by one. That's why we say perception is simultaneous, expression is linear. So writing tends to be slightly difficult, if we admit. Because of that, not everybody can produce a newspaper. As for speaking, anybody with a voice can speak. And because of that, one can always express your deepermost emotions, anger, in anything. So regulation helps us to moderate that. Then the speed of it and its impact. Because of this, we have completely different ways of regulating broadcasting from print. If you don't make this starting distinction, you get it wrong. Then the next thing is that when we come to broadcasting, policy contains 3 elements. And I really need you to come with me on this one. Broadcasting policy must contain 3 things. It has technical rules, which spectrum you can use, what transmitters you can use. The director of engineering was explaining to us the parameters for assigning the frequencies and how you do it. All these are rules within a broadcasting law. And those are the things that we call the technical rules. And then we have the behavioral rules, or what we call the content rules. What can you carry about pornography, incitement, and issues like that? Those are the behavioral rules. Then I put a question mark on competition. Is the market question that Bernard? Where is Bernard? Okay, the market questions that Bernard was raising, the number of radio stations you can have in a polity and all that, we'll get back to that. In countries that have regulation policy or competition institutions, you don't put the competition issues in your broadcasting law or policy. That then belongs to the competition authority. Exactly, Your Excellency, the market. So in the UK, in the US, the rules guiding competition tend to be in the antitrust rules. So if you look at broadcasting policy and regulation, it is these 2 elements that you will have. How we put them together is also a question of policy. We have 2 sets of regulatory systems. We have converged regulatory systems and non-converged regulatory systems. In a converged regulatory system, one regulator deals with both the technical parameters and the behavioral parameters. In a non-converged regulatory system, you have a technical regulator that is dealing with technical issues. Then you have a behavioral regulator that is dealing with content issues. By policy, Ghana chose a non-converged regulatory system. So we created the National Communications Authority to deal with technical issues. We created the National Media Commission to deal with issues. This distinction is very, very crucial for the next steps in our policy formulation. Now, if you want to, then we decided that we propose a broadcasting law in which we wrongfully, in my view, and I stress this, when you have a non-converged regulator, you set rules for the non-converged regulator. If you have a converged regulator, you set rules for the converged regulator. So I'm repeating this. Your technical regulator in a non-converged regulatory system is dealing with technical issues. Your behavioral regulator is dealing with behavioral issues. So we have the National Media Commission, we have the NCA. But when we decided to pass a law, we went and put together a converged piece of regulation on a non-converged regulatory system. This is the craziest policy intervention I have seen anywhere in the world. So, you have in Ghana as we speak, for all the technical regulatory issues, we have the Electronic Communications Act and the accompanying regulations. It has, in my view, even though the professionals who work on it have identified issues that they want to improve, the provisions in that law are far superior to what we had put into the proposed broadcasting law. So the proposed broadcasting law actually takes us backwards instead of moving us forward. And then on top of that, we have added behavioral issues within that same piece of legislation when we are operating a non-converged regulatory system. This is the problem with the broadcasting law. So, a few years ago, the National Media Commission decided that because we have the problem with the broadcasting industry is that you have a technical regulator, they have all the rules on technical regulation in the Electronic Communications Act and the regulations. You have a behavioral regulator, which is the National Media Commission. They have inadequate legislation. So the way to resolve the problem is not to complicate it further. It is simply to amend the behavioral regulators law to improve the gaps. This was the simplest, easiest task that was ahead of us. Instead, we decided to go and pass a law that was going to complicate our lives. So what did the NMC do? NMC decided that, okay, the broadcasting law that is proposed, it has technical component, it has behavioral component. All the technical components are inferior to what we have in the electronic communications regulations. So let us take out all the behavioral elements in that proposal and put them into a content regulatory instrument to complement the technical parameters in the electronic communications regulations. This, the Supreme Court said, amounted to censorship. We strongly believe that the court, and I think that significant members of the court have told us in private, that they didn't understand the policy orientation, they didn't understand the technology. You can't hold anybody responsible for that. Interestingly, and I really want to challenge people to check this, the philosophy that defined the law in Ghana, the Supreme Court struck down our law in November 2016. By June 2017, the Germans have already started talking to us about the philosophy of that law. We can't claim credit, but 7 months later, they passed what became the generally known as the Facebook law, which was the first major attempt to define a content regulatory parameters that would deal with behavioral issues across all platforms, not only in broadcasting. And this was the philosophy for what we did 10 years ago. Now, what Germany did has become the Digital Services Act in the whole of the EU. In the UK, they've passed a similar piece of legislation called the Online Safety Act. The Freedom House last year published that a minimum of about 70% of the global population now live in countries that are working towards the philosophy that we had advocated 10 years ago. So let us quickly go to, as we sit now, if we want to address broadcasting regulation in Ghana, we have 3 options. Very, very simple options based on the analysis I've done for you. Option 1 is to keep and improve the non-converged approach that we have. In which case, let us take the NCA Act. If there are any gaps in the technical regulations that we want, let's improve them. Then we take the NMC Act. Whatever gaps we see in them, let's improve them. It is the easiest, simplest, non-complicated. The second option is for us to move away from the non-converged regulatory system that we've created for ourselves and to create a converged regulator. That is going to have constitutional implications or operational implications. If you decide that you are going to create a converged regulator, you are either merging some aspects of NCA's work and that of NMC, or you are taking the NMC's content regulatory work and handing it over to NCA. If you decide to hand the content regulatory work of NMC to NCA, it's viable. It will then look like Ofcom or the FCC in the US. However, because NMC's functions are set in the Constitution, you will necessarily have to amend the Constitution. So that would imply constitutional amendment. If, on the other hand, you decide that you are taking NCA's work that relates to broadcasting to give it to NMC, you are going to disrupt the unity of command in the management of spectrum. And let me explain that. A couple of years ago, we knew that each spectral band could perform certain defined services. And so it was very easy for regulators to cut up the bands and say, this is for this is for this, that is for that. Convergence has made it extremely difficult to now separate the spectrum resources like that. So if you decide to cut that part to hand it over, as some people have advocated, you are going to completely kill innovation within your country. And that is why, even though this option exists, I do not see it as a forward-looking option, even though I hear some academics and advocates talk about that. The third option is to keep the confusion, okay, and pursue the, in my view, completely policy anomalous proposal in the broadcasting law. I have not met anybody in the field who understands broadcasting policy and legislation who feels that this is the way to go. In fact, one officer from Ofcom had written in a piece that he delivered in South Africa that I confronted him very harshly, that he could not see how an enlightened society like Ghana could take such a stupid decision. And that was his language. I confronted him, but I knew deep down within me he was speaking the truth. So these are the options I see for Ghana, and if we decide to do it right, it's not too complicated. The other thing that I want to quickly draw attention to, and I miss Engineer Fianco, but the other engineer is here. We are moving into digital broadcasting, and the digital migration process comes with a number of, everybody sees this as technology, but it comes with a number of big governance and legal issues that we need to confront within policy. Quickly, for those of you who are not too familiar with the process, in migration, of course, we have big advantages in migrating, but the policy issues that emerge is that we are unbundling the services between technical transmission and content production. So if you took today's broadcaster, for example, in analog mode, the same company is producing the content and doing the transmission. So if you took Director General's GBC or any one of them, in full migration process, the transmission system goes to a digital signal distributor. So most of the broadcasting stations will cease their own transmission systems. And there is one signal distributor that is managing the transmission. So the first issue that emerges is between the signal distributor and the content producer, who is the broadcaster? And it's not a moot question, because the definition of who the broadcaster is determines who bears liability for offensive content. Okay? The same definition also decides who benefits from constitutional protections for media. Okay? In simple, the simplest way that the average person may say, okay, why not decide that they are both broadcasters? That's a pathway out. However, if you do that, the first thing that emerges is that at tort law, the lawyers here would confirm to you that anybody who contributes to a tort becomes liable. So if I'm the signal distributor and I'll be held liable for the content that the content producer brings to me, then I should have the right to exclude content that is likely to create difficulties for me. But if I did that, I will become a technical censor of your content. Meanwhile, Constitution prohibits censorship. So we've got to address that question that looks like a simple question about the definitional question of who the broadcaster is. There are a number of issues that we could raise here, but just to fast-track the process, I'll just leave that one. The other issues that we definitely need to address moving forward when we get into a policy is to look at the Constitution again. Articles 162 and 163, cross-referencing against 164, raises issues about how to address misinformation, hate speech, and ethical standards. Why? 162, 163 guarantees all the freedoms for the media. In 164, it says all the freedoms that we have are subject to laws that are reasonably required in the interest of public morality, public order, and for the protection of the reputations of others. If you read that provision very carefully, and national security or public order per se is not a limitation on the right to free expression. It is laws on public order or public morality. Where are those laws? And then the Constitution says laws that are reasonably required. So even if there is a law, that law must be reasonably required. what is the determination of reasonability? These are critical questions that we need to address if we are to clarify policy regarding free expression and standards. And then the next one is about how we build consensus on national content standards rooted in democratic principles and Ghanaian cultural values. When we talk about behavioral issues and culture, they are very complicated. The average dressing of a woman, for example, on an American TV would be considered indecent in Saudi Arabia, because the degree of covering that you need will be inadequate. And there are two key systems by which we define this, either by physical parameters or what we call the psychological parameters. So if it's by physical parameters, it is looking at the degree of exposure of the human body. How much of my body is exposed as I sit on television? So if a woman's, say, top reveals a little of the chest, in some jurisdictions they will say this is pornographic or indecent. You understand? In some jurisdictions, it should be good fashion. When we talk about our standards in Ghana, how do we define that? So take a depot dancer, for example, on television. Is that culture? Is that pornography? Is that indecency? And whose culture really should formulate the national standard? We've got to address these questions. Across Europe and North America, there are certain issues that would not be issues here. If somebody denied the Holocaust in Ghana, really, it's not an issue. But if you deny the Holocaust in much of Europe, that would constitute a criminal offense. So those standards, we necessarily need to find a way to define them as we define broadcasting policy, particularly with regards to content. Then I come to Bernard's concern, and I just put this in to show something. When we talk about market, the question of how many radio stations can an economy contain, it is not based on our gut feelings. Bernard did a brilliant job by raising the question of population. But I just want to submit that there are existing formula for dealing with these issues. We've got to do the right regulatory impact analysis with empirical science to determine these issues rather than our gut feelings. So this is one method we use. The other that was borrowed from telecoms, concentration analysis, is also what we call the HHI, which is the Heffendal-Hirschman Index, easily used for concentration analysis, but you can always work back the formula to address the optimal numbers that you need. Then, I just make the point that in dealing with the figures, I do not think that it is okay to just talk about the numbers and the population. We've got to deal with the hard questions. Questions of economic viability, thresholds borrowed from competition law, issues about pluralism and the spectral resources. So these are the issues that I want to share with you. Thank you very much.